I criticized 3 history YouTubers and they all responded to me. I criticized the first for not using the work of historians in his assessment of history. In response, he cut out my sources and quotes from historians, saying they were, quote, boring, and tried to disparage an expert historian as, quote, not a historian. I criticized one for, among other things, defending a Nazi. In response, he said I was defaming him, and then doubled down on defending the Nazi. The third argued emphatically for why he should be allowed to say a slur, criticized my dishonest portrayal of him, and then doubled down on why he should be allowed to say the slur. This is how Shadiversity opens his video on me.
As we begin this video, I'd like to ask you an important question. Does truth matter? If it does, you should find this video very important.
And this is how Metatron opens his video on me.
Take your shot, fun boy. You got me, dead bang.
Take your shot, Freddy boy.
The creators disparaged me as a liar, a quote, intellectual fraud and more, while clearly intentionally cutting my arguments so as to make them appear to say something they didn't, cutting my evidence that contradicted them and more. I will show the ways in which their behavior reinforces my original assessment of them, how their methodology is unsuited to working with history, and how their behavior in their responses actually made them appear to be worse than I had originally thought. I'll source all my claims at the top of the screen, just like I did with the previous video. Whenever I'm showing someone's argument here, there is a timestamp as well, so you can go to that video and make sure I did not clip them out of context. When I source a book, article, or document, they will appear similarly down to the page number if available. All of this is also in the bibliography in the description down below. This is how all of my videos are made. It's about honesty, transparency, and making knowledge more accessible. This is not a courtesy these creators showed me, as that would make what they were doing very obvious. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game available for free on PC, console, and mobile. War Thunder sports immersive and incredible visual detail to the point where I actually used its in-game model of the MiG-17 as a reference when building and painting my own model plane MiG-17. The detail of War Thunder's damage model exceeds anything else I've ever seen. Every hit you take impacts parts and elements of your vehicle, which is then reflected in your vehicle's performance. You can see this happen in War Thunder's X-ray vision view. You can operate over 2,500 tanks, planes, helicopters, and ships of 10 major nations all the way from the interwar years into the modern era of jets and main battle tanks, all modeled to this level of detail. There's something in the game for everyone. My friends like the higher level jet fights with beyond visual range missiles. I prefer the more up close and personal World War II aviation. Join 95 million players in large PvP battles today with an immense amount of content to discover. I've put a couple of hundred hours into this game and that's just playing a couple of the available nations. Play War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile now by using the link in the description or the pinned comment below. New players and those of you who haven't played for at least 6 months on PC and consoles get a massive bonus pack if you use my link. The pack includes 7 days of premium, 100,000 silver lions, and the exclusive Eagle of Valor vehicle decorator. This bonus is available for a limited time only. The very first thing we need to discuss, which will set the tone for the rest of this video, is Metatron's approach to sources and academia. Throughout his video response to me, he consistently cuts away whenever I read the work of expert historians who are refuting his claims or arguing against his method or approach to history. It's not just that he doesn't want his audience to hear the arguments from the expert historians, he doesn't want to hear them himself. To conclude, I'd like to read a couple of quotes from Roderick Stackelberg.
And once again, quotation after quotation after quotation. That's Fredda 101. Also, that's not a historian, man. That's not a historian.
He does this on multiple occasions. Cutting this quote means cutting my argument. The evidence is part of my argument. I am quoting an expert's conclusion from their research on the topic. Said expert does not agree with Metatron, which is possibly why he chose to cut the quote and try to disparage Roderick Stackelberg by calling him, quote, not a historian. Not once, but twice. This is unambiguous. He doesn't believe Roderick Stackelberg is a historian, or wants you to believe he isn't one. Roderick Stackelberg was a professor of history for 26 years at Gonzaga University in Washington. His favorite expression was one by Paul Goodman, which read, "The repressed and excluded are always right in their rebellion because they stand for our future wholeness." He authored several books on Nazi Germany. He also authored the Routledge Companion to Nazi Germany. Routledge is an academic publishing house that publishes academic journals and books. The book I quoted was on my curriculum in a graduate-level course on the ideology of Nazism and fascism that I took during my undergraduate degree because I knew I was going to go for a graduate degree in history. Roderick Stackelberg was a historian. Roderick Stackelberg was a good historian. Don't slander his memory. The thesis of Metatron's video is that the Nazis were not right-wing, and that Nazism should instead fall under a category called totalitarian dictatorship. That's neither left or right-wing. Here are the words of the expert on the topic, historian Roderick Stackelberg, that Metatron chose to omit from his video. The conventional image of Nazi Germany as a totalitarian monolith in which every aspect of life was totally controlled from the top is misleading in several respects. For one thing, it implies that Nazi rule was maintained solely by coercion rather than, as was more generally the case, by popular consensus. The 3 dots indicate that I'm skipping later to the text here. It should be remembered that much that took place in Nazi Germany was not distinctively Nazi. Most importantly, perhaps, the monolith model fails to take into account the persistence of conflict and differences within and between government, party, and societal institutions, despite their hierarchical command structures. Quoting him again from the introduction. In my interpretation, Nazism is unambiguously a movement of the right, the conservative end of the spectrum. Perhaps now it makes sense why I would cut this and try to discredit the expert. Metatron loves to bandy about the term strawman, calling any sort of assertion about his politics, born out of an analysis, a strawman. Essentially, if I allege anything about his position that he hasn't said literally and word for word, to him it is a strawman, even if he actually agrees that it's an accurate representation of his positions.
So already it's a strawman. However, there are some academics that do nonsense like this, so I'm actually gonna do that now, because you're wrong, regardless. Even though it wasn't my original point, I'll agree with this fictitious version of myself that you created.
I mean, clearly it's not so fictitious, is it? In the video, I criticize his tendency to pander to his audience's preconceived notions. In light of that, Metatron throws shade on a supposed subset of academia in a very interesting way.
Good historians don't do that, so we can agree with that, but activists who use their degrees to push their agenda?
Oh, they will.
Not that I need to, anyone watching this knows this already, but I'm happy to prove this with empirical data anytime.
There's apparently a bunch of activists in academia spreading falsehoods about history, and Metatron doesn't have to prove this because you already know it's true. This is pandering to your preconceived notions. It's anti-intellectual in a simple sense, but it's also anti-history in a way, because it lays the groundwork for the idea that maybe we shouldn't trust these professors if what they're saying clashes with our preconceived notions about history. He was saying, be careful about trusting those historians just because they have degrees, because you know what some of them are up to. You assert things as, quote, just the facts and reason your way towards why these so-called facts you're presenting are true, without relying on much evidence produced by trained historians.
I have a team behind my production. One is a trained historian, former archaeologist, 2 years of experience digging in Syria, one is a published author, one is an anthropologist with a postdoctoral degree, one is an Egyptologist PhD. I can continue. Also considering that I've shown their names, qualifications, and faces on screen multiple times, but it doesn't matter, because he doesn't care about the truth, nor does he care about evidence. He's gonna say they don't exist.
No, I'm not going to say they don't exist, and please, I want you to continue until the point where you mention the expert on the history of Nazi Germany, because that's what I'm talking about in my video. I didn't see you cite them or their work in your video, so I assume that if you have an expert on this topic on retainer, you didn't utilize them, because utilizing their work and not citing them would be plagiarism, a form of academic misconduct, as we both know. It's all well and good that you have expert friends, I do too, it's nice, but it's rarely relevant to my videos, and if it was, I would cite their work. I don't know if the archaeologist who dug in Syria for 2 years is the best person to be consulting on whether or not Nazi Germany is left or right wing, so I don't see how relevant it is to bring this up. Also, published author could mean literally anything, it could be Shadiversity. In the beginning of the video, I outlined some of the fundamentals of how history is written and understood by quoting the historians who do the work on this, and from whom I learned. I do this because me and Metatron have differing views on the fundamentals of history as a field. I believe my view is correct and that his is incorrect. I have to outline how history works at an academic level in order to explain my position, and hopefully educate some of the viewers. Metatron was thoroughly uninterested in listening to this, but completely fine with making judgments about what I was saying without actually hearing it. The study and understanding of the field of history itself is referred to as historiography. It's something you have to go through first at an undergraduate level, then you have to go through it again at a graduate level because it's so important. I know this because I did this. I understand history not to be apolitical, and I understand it to be rife with the subjectivities of its authors. I explained this in the video and cited the arguments of experts. Metatron portrays this understanding of history as absurd, and cuts the arguments of the experts. Here's how Metatron portrays me after I explain the inherent impossibility of truly objective history writing without any form of subjectivity, bias, or impact on the history writing by the present political climate. To close off this point about history being a conduit between the past and the present, let me quote American historian Untitled Chapter.
Yeah, let's not, considering the fact that he's gonna use now a very long and boring quotation to try and refute an argument that isn't mine.
Here's a quote by E.H. Carr from his book What is History? Quote,
Hold it there, Professor. Rather than listening to the quote, boring you to death. Alright, so now he's attacking the concept of objective truth in relation to history. If at any point you had any doubt that this was anything but a propaganda channel, welcome to Reality Check.
I already read the quote from E.H. Carr's book in my past video, the one that Metatron cut out. In this video, I want to read what Sir Richard J. Evans, expert on Nazi Germany, had to say about the book. What is History played a central role in the historiographical revolution in Britain in the 1960s. As an undergraduate, I devoured its witty and cogent attacks on the kind of history I had been taught at school, dominated by high politics and diplomacy, bereft of theory, and entirely innocent of any consciousness that it might be serving some kind of ideological or political purpose. Metatron's history writing, such as it is either bereft of any consciousness that it might be serving some kind of ideological or political purpose, or he is conscious of it and hides the fact. Quote, "For the historian, what is history is important for many reasons. Above all, it makes clear again and again that whether we like it or not, there is always a subjective element in historical writing, for historians are individuals, people of their time, with views and assumptions about the world that they cannot eliminate from their writing and research, even if they can hope to restrain them, subordinate them to the intractabilities of the material with which they are working, and enable readers to study their work critically by making these views and assumptions explicit. It is in this respect that Carr has been most influential, and his views most widely accepted by historians, and for this reason more than any, that his work will endure. Metatron does not make his views and assumptions explicit so that viewers may study his work critically. He obfuscates them behind a veneer of complete objectivity and political centrism. Whereas historians have widely accepted E.H. Carr's ideas, as Evans said, Metatron rejects these fundamentals of how history is understood.
Now, to try and strengthen this absurdity that he has just mentioned, he's gonna read a quote to, as always, pretend to be smarter than you, as he does. Fredda is not used to use the sources to make his own contributions to the historical field as any advanced academic does. He's used to repeat what someone else says, as undergraduates do. Moreover, this is the best example of Dunning-Kruger effect. He knows a little, overestimates his knowledge and competence, but that's enough for him to think he's better than anyone else. I mean, look at this.
What does he even mean by this? Let me just add that I'm laughing here because he said he was going to math his way to figuring out if the Nazis were left or right wing, which I found so intensely stupid it made me laugh. Of course, he cut out the thing I'm laughing at. Metatron criticized me for reading quotes to, and I quote, pretend to be smarter than you. He also criticized me for not doing my own primary source research, even if it's a topic that generations of historians have already researched and written on. I do actually do primary source research when it's necessary. Primary source is something you are analyzing to construct your own understanding of the source. Metatron says I'm not used to doing primary source research. Never mind the fact that I've done archival research on several occasions and utilized primary sources in past videos, I do primary source research in the very video he is responding to. And he should know this because he includes it in his own video. When Metatron cited Friedrich Pollock, I read the text, analyzed it, and found that Metatron lied about what Pollock was saying. I used Pollock's work, which ostensibly presents as a secondary source, to analyze what Pollock was trying to say vis-a-vis what Metatron was claiming he was saying, and to evaluate its usefulness as a source. I relied on no analysis but my own. This is primary source research. There's a profound irony to all this. I read the words of experts because I am well aware of my limitations, that I cannot be an expert in every field. Even so, I do work with primary sources, but I also couch all of that work in the work of the experts. No historian is perfect. No historian is an expert on every field. No historian is equipped to do primary research on every single topic. This is why historians rely on and cite other historians as well. This is why history as a field builds upon itself gradually, so that the work of past historians lives in the work of current historians. Every, quote, high-level academic, as Metatron calls them, that does primary source research does not do so in isolation from the work of other historians, but in relation to it. They read what others have done on the topic and fit their work into this. When you are looking to answer a question such as, are Nazis left or right wing, you would look at how past historians have approached the topic first, justify why your research is necessary and why you can't just rely on theirs, and introduce your own research and conclusions. Metatron chose instead to sidestep all other academic work on the question which he sought to answer. When I brought up academic work on the topic, he chose to omit it from his video and insult my intelligence for doing so. In fact, as this is a response to a video where I criticized him for not citing sources, he had ample opportunity to produce said sources in the response video. He chose not to and had the gall to claim this.
All we do on this channel is use the sources.
In fact, later in the video, he makes a claim that all I do is add, quote, ideologically driven facts that clearly clash with documented evidence upon close inspection. Yet in his pre-prepared response to me where he makes this claim, he never presented any documented evidence that clashes with any of my claims about history. In fact, he didn't present any sources at all. Surely the person suffering from Dunning-Kruger must be the one convinced of their own infallibility and perfect objectivity, who thinks so highly of themselves they believe they're capable of standing above the experts on topics they have absolutely no experience in dealing with.
A word an actual historian would use. Oh my gosh, what a sanctimonious narcissist.
Him calling me a narcissist is pretty rich from a guy who spends approximately 4% of his video laughing at his own jokes and sells a plushie in his own likeness to his viewers. 4% might not sound like much, but it certainly did to me when editing.
Fredda wants you to believe that if you don't use a particular term, your entire argument is invalid, as stupid as that sounds. Do you see how weak of a line of argumentation this is once you actually look at it? And pardon me if I indulge, but this type of argument is not what a real historian would use.
Yes, that would be a pretty weak line of argumentation. Luckily it's not mine, it's his. He made it up. Metatron approaches the issue of whether Nazi Germany was left or right-wing in a very strange way for someone working with history, and describes an issue with the question itself, that being presentism, but uses different wording and a different approach to explain this than what I would expect from a trained historian. I say that presentism is a term an actual historian would use. Metatron misconstrues this to mean my entire line of argumentation is that he uses the wrong term, therefore he isn't a historian. As opposed to Metatron, I watched his entire video before I started recording and editing my own response. When a video is uploaded to YouTube, I've done all the research I'm going to do for that video. Meaning, when I make this point, I obviously also know the things that appear later in the video, even if Metatron doesn't, because he hasn't seen it yet. Me saying he's not a real historian is not based purely on his unconventional vocabulary. It's based on an assessment on his method and approach to history. Look at the sources for the video I critiqued. Look at his stated disdain for my use of secondary sources written by experts in the field. Look at how he disparages an expert whose work counters his argument. And look at how he throws shade at academia, implying there's activists lurking in there pushing some secret agenda. Look at how he completely rejects the historiographical developments in the field of history since the 1960s, and frames me communicating them as an assault on truth and a propaganda effort. These are some of the key reasons I don't consider Metatron a historian. To me, what makes someone a historian is not their degree, level of academic achievement, and so on. Anyone can be a historian. I've cited non-academic historians before. All that matters, at least to me, is that you abide by certain best practices and standards. If you practice history writing like a historian would, I would call you a historian. However, if I, for example, see no sources cited or sources approached in a horribly haphazard or irresponsible way, I would not call you a historian. Having a degree is not necessary, but the process of getting that degree trains you in these best practices. Therefore, it can be an advantage, but it's not a necessity and it doesn't have to be an advantage. The reason I prefer to cite academic historians over non-academic ones is that academics most often publish their work through academic publishers, which means their work is peer-reviewed, which essentially means other experts have evaluated their work. Whenever I or Metatron approach a primary source, our work is not peer-reviewed in the way an expert secondary source would be. Our work is inherently less trustworthy as a result, because it hasn't undergone any sort of formal review. Metatron doesn't want you to know this. And his supposed team, which is probably more likely his friends, don't qualify as a form of peer review.
Also notice this, I'm clearly intellectually honest. For him, he has never made a video to debunk someone on the left. Does that sound like unbiased academic neutrality to you?
Never is quite a strong word, especially considering you show one of my thumbnails featuring two literal left-wing ministers of government, both from the 2021 to 2025 Jonas Gahr Støre government. One is a member of the Labour Party, the other is a member of the Agrarian Party. In the video, I criticize them for their academic misconduct. The video is cited above like everything else. Shadiversity makes an argument that indicates I didn't give him his proper day in court, since I criticize history creators and I kind of didn't talk much about his history videos. At the end of my video, I say I couldn't talk as much about history as I wanted to. He took this to be about him, saying I should have just looked into his history videos. But it was actually about the larger structure of my video. Even on the Metatron section, where I mostly critique Metatron's video on Nazi Germany, I felt as if Metatron wasn't talking enough about history for me to engage properly. After all, Metatron cited only a single source, and it was a primary source from 1941, before the war was even over. That being said, I think Shadiversity is right. In a video about history creators, I should have talked more about Shad's history, and I will do so in this video. First, let's listen to his criticism. I said most of Shad's output is on his non-history channel called Night's Watch. Here's what Shad said. However, the majority of his output, in terms of quantity at least, is on a channel called Night's Watch, started in 2020.
That's actually incorrect. I'm making more videos on Shadiversity than Night's Watch, and it would have only taken the most cursory glance to confirm that. On Night's Watch, I'm making one video a week, or even sometimes one video every 2 weeks. Now, my output was, more later on, but if he's making a video that is critiquing me currently, it might be worth actually doing some current research. And think about this, if Fredda is so lazy to not even confirm some of the most basic, simple facts, where it literally just takes, looking at the current YouTube content of the person that you are defaming, if he can't even be that bothered to do such minimal research, how reliable do you really think he is on anything else he says?
His argument here is actually so compelling that when I was first watching this, he actually almost gaslit me into thinking I had made a mistake. Of course, I did do this research, and I did confirm these basic simple facts. The reason I almost believed him is that that in this video he cut off the total number of videos on Night's Watch. Later, when he's not trying to make this point that I'm wrong about the quantity of his output and lazy for not doing my research, he does show the Night's Watch video count. I think the former instance was done deliberately. My scientist girlfriend helped me by collating the data, then she plotted a graph illustrating my point. This whole thing is very silly, but I hope I'm illustrating the differences between how I approach these things and how these guys do it. If you consult the graph, from August 2024 to August 20th, 2025, the day this data was collated, he's producing more videos on Shadiversity. This is the slice that Shadiversity wants us to look at, and he claims that looking at more than this makes me lazy. My argument was that the majority of his output in terms of quantity is on Night's Watch, not specifically between August 2024 and August 2025. If you expand your scope beyond just this narrow slice, things start to look a lot different. We factored in shorts, live streams, and videos, and placed them in our own category so as to keep everything as transparent and clear as possible. Because we're comparing output between two channels, it's important the time frame is the same on both. So we measured from the first upload on Night's Watch, which was January 13th, 2021, to the date of writing this, which was August 20th. Comparing the numbers, there is a 24.32% higher output on Night's Watch than Shadiversity if you're counting full videos, excluding shorts and live streams, but including members-only videos as well, which I think is fair. It is part of his output. If you count everything, including live streams, shorts, and all videos, Night's Watch still has an 18.32% higher output. So no, I was not being lazy, I just wasn't selecting for a particular time frame that paints Shadiversity in the best possible light, instead choosing the time frame that minimizes selection bias, that being beginning to end. Speaking of selection bias, Shadiversity alleges I cherry-picked reviews that disliked his book, and called me dishonest for not showing the Amazon review score. For one, this wasn't an ad. Two, I don't think the Amazon review score really says that much about the content of the book, because virtually every book gets 4.5 stars. Twilight, The Communist Manifesto, What is History, which I've cited many times before, all have 4.5 stars. They have wildly different content that different people will find objectionable, but the rating is the same. In fact, when searching for high-profile controversial books, the highest-rated book I could find was actually The Essential Speeches of Hitler at 5 stars. I don't think these common ratings say anything about the contents of any of these books beyond the fact that for all of them, many people were compelled to rate the book highly for one reason or another. The reason I looked at Goodreads is that I've gone there for written reviews before, and it's worked for me. Goodreads happens to have the lowest rating for his book, but again, I didn't care about the ratings or make a point of it, as he himself said. I selected reviews which Shad called cherry-picking, because there are too many reviews to read them all. I specifically tried to select for longer reviews that said they were fans of Shad on YouTube, as indicated by 2 of the 3 reviews I read, being long reviews that explicitly said they were fans of Shad on YouTube. The third review I included because it was funny and it worked as a summary of what was said in the other 2 reviews. Shad wanted me to read 1 bad review and 1 great review. I instead chose to read 2 reviews that seemed very genuine and not astroturfed or brigaded, and 1 review that I found funny. In this video, Metatron accuses me of, quote, poisoning the well, when I cite my old video detailing the exact same method Metatron is using to mislead his audience. That video was on a YouTube history creator who at the time was a member of a fascist party. I talked more about this method in my previous video, whereby it was used by a literal out-and-about Nazi.
And here it is. I was actually surprised they still hadn't come to that. Here is the mental manipulation. Let's look at this closely. I talk about objective reality and facts. Then he says that so do the actual Nazi. What is the conclusion he wants you to draw then? Metatron says X, Nazis say X, Metatron is a Nazi.
Metatron uses this to argue that I have called him a Nazi in order to poison the well. I didn't do that, and Metatron is being very silly, very dishonest, and very tendentious. Let's say my video was about assessing whether or not Metatron is a Nazi. I would present evidence for and against, and then in the conclusion I would make my assessment, where the overwhelming evidence shows he is not a Nazi. Now imagine if Metatron then chose to only show one single bit where I said Nazis drink water and Metatron drinks water, but chose not to show the bit at the end where I say Metatron clearly doesn't like Hitler. You would come out thinking I just called him a Nazi, right? You don't have to imagine this part, because that is exactly what he did. Here is what I said in my video. I think Metatron isn't a very big fan of Hitler, and is understandably also not a fan of his politics and his views being associated with Hitler. He knows I explicitly tell viewers of my video that he's not a Nazi, but he still chose to keep this part in the video that he made, where he tells his viewers that I'm trying to do mental manipulation. He says I engage in 2 logical fallacies, one which is guilt by association. I didn't, of course, I cited my past video for the method being used. It's not my fault the person is a Nazi. The other supposed fallacy I will allow him to explain himself.
2 logical fallacies at once, and it's been extremely disingenuous and dishonest. First of all, framing language. He's using emotionally loaded terms, aka Nazis.
I'm not quite sure what he wants from me here. Does he want me to not call the person who openly praises Hitler a Nazi? It feels as if he's just gone down a list of logical fallacies and is trying to figure out which ones he can use against me. He accuses me of poisoning the well by equating him with the Nazis, which I did not do. In turn, here's how this intellectual titan and guardian of truth and honesty decides to portray me.
On his X account we read, Marx had some ideas, with a picture of a gulag in the background. We are all his enemies anyways, so he has plenty of choice. Just telling it how it is, facts over feelings, more like gulag over Stalin. Make no mistake, Fredda is a propaganda channel.
He even puts on dramatic music for these sections where he's portraying me as a Stalinist villain, and then calls me the propagandist. It's incredibly funny. I have no particular love for Stalin, nor have I expressed anything of the sort, but that obviously doesn't matter to him. To arrive at this conclusion, he uses my Twitter bio that says Marx had some ideas. I think he did, which is why he's influential in the field of history and sociology. He uses my header, which is an insanely funny shot from the 2014 movie Muppets Most Wanted, where Kermit the Frog's identical twin is in a Soviet gulag. A Muppets movie. Spooky. He uses something called ProLwiki as an authoritative source for my politics. He very clearly is making the implication that I incite violence towards liberals, as he positions his own avatar in this position when he speaks, and he has chosen to position my avatar there now, alongside these words, which are obviously not mine. There is simply no other reasonable way to interpret this than as him considering this an honest portrayal of my beliefs. I would very strongly encourage him to remove this portion of the video. Again, these are not my words, and I don't think Metatron understands the gravity of what he's doing here. Of course, at the same time as he's doing all this, Metatron makes the following point.
I swear, this thing you do when you put words into people's mouths they have never said and then try to ridicule and attack them for those words you fabricated, you do it so much that it has just become second nature to you. It's muscle memory at this point with this guy.
In fact, in a video on 3 different creators, in a section of the introduction where I'm not addressing Metatron specifically, he does this. And for some reason, the end result of this development almost always looks like an hour-long video essay about why women don't belong in video games.
After a charged statement like this, what he should be doing, if he was intellectually honest, is producing a clip to substantiate the claim, where I say this, but he can't do it.
Note that despite including my statement, he shows a different statement which I did not make. Then, to refute that, he shows evidence of his statements on women in history, which I was not talking about. The absence of evidence does not mean the non-existence of it, but when he chose to refute this straw man, he did not produce evidence that he does believe women belong in the video game sphere. He didn't even have to address this point as it wasn't directed at him. He chose to do so and couldn't defend himself. I don't think this clip needs much introduction or context. Shadiversity provides everything you need to know.
I objected to Games Workshop trying to exclude people from their hobby, and it's mostly people that lean more right, and usually they do that by vilifying those type of people, saying that those are intolerant bigots that don't belong in our spaces. Because he latches onto the fact that I talk about Arch, formerly Arch Warhammer, and the disingenuous point that he takes ages to get to is that Arch is basically a Nazi in his mind, and therefore it was justified in excluding him from the Warhammer community, and Shad is bad because he is defending what equates to as equivalent to Nazis.
I think that's pretty bad, yeah.
And he also slanders my audience as all being Nazis as well.
Shad is offended by this, or at the very least pretends to be in order to appeal to his Nazi or Nazi-adjacent fans. As you might have heard in the very clip he showed here, I didn't actually say that. Maybe it's a misunderstanding, but given the totality of the evidence that I have seen in making this video, which you're going to see as you keep watching, I don't think it was a misunderstanding. What I said here is that Shadiversity has Nazi or Nazi-adjacent fans, and that these fans like it when he defends the Nazi YouTuber. I did not say that all his fans are Nazis. That would be fucking insane, stupid, and very easy to disprove. He's kinda stuck in this Gamergate era of YouTube content, where everyone would throw around terms like this willy-nilly. And a good way to shore up support among your right-wing audience was always to have your opponent call you and all your viewers Nazis. I didn't do that, but it's a classic Gamergate-era content trope, so we had to find a way to get that in there. What I did do is call Arch Warhammer a Nazi, and what Shadiversity did do was defend Arch Warhammer. As you'll see, he will double down on this. Unfortunately, there will be more discussion of Gamergate stuff later in this video.
Arch is not a Nazi. He has spoken out against totalitarianism, communism, and Nazism multiple times, but he does share edgy jokes, and he likes edgy humors. He thinks they're funny. But that is easily enough to qualify him as a complete Nazi, and therefore justified in being discriminated against. People like Fredda are perfectly in favor of discrimination and bigotry, so long as their targets are evil enough. And if they're not evil enough, they will just slander and inflate and take out of context to turn them into villains to justify that type of bigotry.
So, after this long and passionate speech defending Art Warhammer, here's the basis for me calling Art Warhammer a Nazi. On the 29th of May 2020, Art Warhammer said socialists are not people. In 2019, on the 24th of November, Art Warhammer disparages the indigenous population of Norway and says, quote, "It used to be legal to shoot them." To which one of his handpicked moderators responds, quote, "Time for a field exercise with live ammo." And then Art says, quote, "In the 20s and 40s we were so close to solving the problem. It doesn't take a genius to understand what he's referencing when he talks about the period from the 20s, the rise of fascism in Europe, to the 40s, the fall of fascism in Europe. He's saying fascism is the, quote, solution to this population." Side note, the slur that Lindy Beige continues to insist he's entitled to saying is also directed at the Sami, who are the indigenous population of Norway, the country I and Art are from. On the 9th of January 2020, Art said, quote, "Real fascism leads to a utopian state where every member is both spiritually and physically fulfilled, whilst leaving in as much luxury as the state can possibly afford."
Showing that the true intolerant bigots in this equation are actually people like Fredda.
In 2020, Lore Master of Sotek, a Warhammer-focused creator, spoke out against Art Warhammer's behavior and his community. About his moderators, the creator said this.
I don't know how many moderators he has, because I couldn't read them without getting sick. But he has a moderator who very strongly supports the creation and consumption of child porn, and defends it on a very regular basis, so I'm assuming Arch is totally okay with that, since every creator has to handpick their mods on Discord, so way to really be the champion of the people there, Arch. Great job, dipshit.
The moderator in question is the one which called for the murder of Norway's indigenous population. This is just the tip of the iceberg with Art Warhammer. A far more moderate and seemingly centrist YouTuber in the Warhammer community named Major Kill made a video about Art Warhammer. In it, he theorizes that the Warhammer community at large has for the most part rejected Art and his beliefs. Major Kill's video starts off far more charitable than my commentary does, but by the end of the video he doesn't exactly portray Arch in a very good light.
In all honesty, I went into this video thinking Arch was just an unfunny, try-hard edgelord shit-stirrer who some people just labelled as a Nazi because that's an easy thing to do to people you don't agree with these days. But after deep diving into what he has done, it's clear that in the sacred words of Wheels, Arch Warhammer is indeed a dickhead.
Shadiversity says I just call people who I disagree with Nazis. I don't feel like I do, and in this instance at least, I did not do that. What I did was accuse Shadiversity of coming to the defense of Art Warhammer. Shadiversity, if you do not want someone to accuse you of coming to the defense of a Nazi, do not come to the defense of a Nazi. It's that simple. Speaking of Nazism, when responding to Metatron's analysis of Nazism, I make the point that racism is not inherently right-wing or left-wing, but that racism is more prevalent on the right. Here's how Metatron decided to counter that statement. I believe he's saying this defensively, because he himself knows that racism is more prevalent on the right.
Not if you count anti-white sentiment.
Again, I specifically said I don't believe Metatron is a Nazi in the video. That being said, giving a wink-wink nudge-nudge that the white race is under attack from socialists isn't a great look. Metatron uses Marx's rebuttal to Bruno Bauer's essay titled The Jewish Question to argue that Marx, a man born to a Jewish family, is anti-Semitic. I make the argument that Marx is perhaps less racist than the average German for the time, to which Metatron says,
He just did the very thing that he has been accusing us of doing for this entire video. He used his own reasoning without any evidence to back it up to make a statement about people in history. Checkmate.
The evidence is in the book that's on screen which you claim to have read, where Marx rejects Bruno Bauer's antisemitism. I speculate that Metatron either did not read the book or did not understand it. Metatron actually cut out the latter part and framed it as me confidently asserting that he hasn't read it, when I very much kept open the possibility that he has read it but just didn't understand it. The only other possibility is that he's lying about its contents, and I chose not to make that accusation. He responds the following way. He claims to have read On the Jewish Question, but probably hasn't.
Hey, do you have a citation for that? Any evidence for that statement, mister? I need to prove everything, I'm super historian. Of course I read it, we read it in high school, for crying out loud.
I'll be charitable and say this is possible, I guess. I think Metatron was a high school teacher, but I'm not absolutely sure, so I won't say that for certain. And I think he might live in the US. And all kinds of crazy stuff has been going on with politicized control over US curriculums in the past years. I'm disappointed it doesn't provide any proof that this is on the high school curriculums, not only because he just demanded a citation from me about whether or not he's read the text, but also because I'm genuinely interested in how something that obscure ended up on the high school curriculum. Back to Shadiversity. The reason I think that Shad misrepresenting what I was saying shouldn't be considered a simple misunderstanding, and instead something done intentionally, is made pretty clear by the following section. For some reason, Shad is also obsessed with AI. If you've seen his Twitter, you'll know that it's pretty much all him coming to the defense of AI and...
No, I also criticize AI in a lot of instances.
Note how I'm getting cut off mid-sentence. I say, he defends AI, and that's it. Let's continue.
If we go to Night's Watch and just type in AI and have a look here, why is this AI slop flooding YouTube? The AI girlfriends will destroy humanity. The Google AI chatbot should be destroyed. How to prevent the AI apocalypse. There are legitimate concerns regarding AI that I have been very vocal on and warning about for ages. I really like AI art generative tools, but all AI, that's a different discussion, isn't it? I have defended AI generative tools, but not in the way that he presents here.
Let's see what he cut out. If you've seen his Twitter, you'll know that it's pretty much all him coming to the defense of AI as, quote, tool-assisted art or something like that. He cut off the part where I make it very clear I'm just talking about AI art, so that he's able to cite his criticism of other applications of AI in his defense. I portrayed his views accurately, but he's so desperate in trying to portray me as a liar, he resorts to this sort of stuff. I know it was done with intent and not an accidental early pause and misunderstanding, because he pre-watched this part as indicated by him introducing my argument before showing it.
When in actual fact, my views on AI art are far more nuanced than what he's presenting. Let's hear what he says.
And then later continuing his video after the bit he cut out. I don't really have a dog in this race beyond the fact that I think AI art looks like dog shit. Tool-assisted art or something like that. I don't really have a dog in this race beyond the fact that I think AI art looks like dog shit. Even there, it's very clear I'm exclusively talking about AI art. This is several minutes of his video where he deliberately and falsely claims I'm misrepresenting him. When making my initial video, I intended to talk about Shadiversity's relationship to the wider hemasphere on YouTube, because I saw indications that a lot of people don't seem to like him. I chose not to because I couldn't find anything too reliable to show as evidence for this. However, on the back of what you just saw, I should show that Shadiversity has a track record of, and tendency for deliberately cutting people in such a way that he can misrepresent them.
And yes, I have seen Shadiversity's response video to me. I think Shad misunderstood the point of my video, and that led him to make a premise for his video based on that misunderstanding. So today, we're gonna clear some things up. So at the beginning of Shad's video, he says that the sword community has been attacked by me, which makes me feel like he doesn't feel like I'm in the sword community.
This is Sellsword Arts. Shadiversity presented their video as an attack on the sword community, in a similar vein to how mine was framed as an attack on truth. The core of the presenter's point is that if you do not practice the art of swordsmanship, you should not present yourself as an authority on the art of swordsmanship. I think this is a perfectly fair statement. In a similar vein, I would say someone like Metatron or Shadiversity should not present themselves as authorities on history without an understanding of or practicing the methodologies of history.
The purpose of my original video was to help educate my followers on the difference between content that's made purely for fantasy and fun and content that's made to help educate them on the way the sword is actually used. Some of my videos were clipped in such a way that it loses necessary context, which reflects poorly on my character in such a way that I feel the need to defend myself.
Shad misrepresented Sellsword Arts. Sellsword Arts received all kinds of hateful and bigoted comments after Shadiversity made his response video. Here's an example where Metatron does something very similar. Now, he says we're going to evaluate whether these regimes lean left or right based on those criteria, but first he constructs a new category called totalitarian dictatorship.
I'm sorry, what? A new category? They are totalitarian dictatorships. Are you going to argue that they were not? How is it a new category?
With Shadiversity, I think it was clear he was being malicious. With Metatron, however, I think it's possible he just did this because he's kind of dumb. He's going to call this an ad hominem attack and criticize me for it. But he should be able to take it, considering the amount of times he made similar comments and then followed up with 8 seconds of laughing at his own joke. When I say he, quote, constructs a new category, he misunderstands me to have said invents a new term, and belittles me for not knowing that people have been using the term totalitarian dictatorship before. What I'm saying is that this is a new category with new criteria compared to his other previously defined criteria for evaluating Nazi Germany's politics, as indicated by the fact that I said exactly that. And in fact, I will argue that Nazi Germany was not a, quote, totalitarian dictatorship, just as the historian Roderick Stackelberg argued in the quote that Metatron cut out. And if Nazi Germany, the society that the word totalitarianism evokes, does not fit the bill, I will go as far as to argue that the term is functionally useless. Here's another more pointed critique of the term itself from historian Enzo Traverso. Quote, Of course, no reasonable observer could deny that both Nazism and Stalinism implemented murderous policies, but their internal logic was deeply different, and this incongruity put into question a concept like totalitarianism, which is focused exclusively on their similarities. This explains the skepticism of many historians, from those of the Munich Institute for Zeitgeschichte, who tried to analyze the German society behind the monolithic facade of the Nazi regime, to the most recent biographers of Hitler and almost all historians of the Holocaust. Continuing. The pillar of the totalitarian model of scholarship remains ideology. It offers a purely negative definition, totalitarianism as anti-liberalism. This is the only way to gather fascism and communism into a single category. This is more or less exactly what I said in my past video. This isn't history, this is ideology. It can be useful in that sense, but it's not that useful to historians. He spends about 2 minutes on this bit, where he proves it's a term because he thinks I thought he invented it. He refers to it as a working definition used by historians, and he proves that it's being used by showing a Google book search, where almost every single result is either from the US State Department or US Congress at the beginning of the Cold War. I'm not making this up. The reason all these search results are from the immediate aftermath of World War II and the beginning of the Cold War, and the reason they're all from organs of the state of the United States, is because this is right around the time when the term takes on a new meaning and begins to decline in use worldwide, except for in the Anglo-American world, and it begins to take on an apologetic function. Quote, "In the name of the struggle against totalitarianism, the free world supported violent military dictatorships in both Asia, from South Korea to Indonesia and Vietnam, and Latin America, from Guatemala to Chile. The brutality of the dictatorships that the West supported in the superpower contest against the Soviet Union is undeniable. This was contextualized in the West as anti-totalitarianism. I'm pointing out how this is an ideological term that is more useful to the foreign policy of the United States than it is to a historian. You can see how virtually all of Metatron's results are from the State Department. Metatron's defense is that this is a working definition and not a category, but the thesis of his video is that we should not categorize the Nazis as either left or right, but instead under totalitarianism. I think I was fair to say he was constructing a category, a new one at that, considering the criteria he put forth are criteria of his own creation, and not those of any scholars of the term of totalitarianism. Because of course if he had used them, he would have cited them, right? Beyond that, the definition is so broad as to encompass virtually every nation on Earth. Most states engage in aspects of these things to varying degrees.
Alright, let me get this straight. Every nation...
Not every nation, here's what I literally just said. Most states engage in aspects of these things to varying degrees. I just don't think it's fair to portray me as saying the nation of Tuvalu fulfills all these criteria. Anyways.
Alright, let me get this straight. Every nation has militarism with resources directed to domestic population. Every nation has authoritarianism and dictatorial rule. Every nation has repression of freedom of speech. Well, probably fewer in charge, I guess. Systematic elimination of political opposition by violence. Are you out of your mind?
On December 4th, 1969, the civil rights activist and communist, in other words, the political enemy of the United States, Fred Hampton was murdered in his bed by the Chicago Police Department as part of a systematic government effort to target political enemies called COINTELPRO. This is all documented through evidence obtained from the FBI in court, from the 1976 Church Committee, and as a result of the investigation into the Watergate scandal. You know, the one where the President of the United States was illegally wiretapping his political enemies. The Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals in 1979 concluded that, quote, "There was serious evidence to support the conclusion that the FBI, Hanrahan, and his men, who were representing the state government, in planning and executing the raid, had participated in a conspiracy designed to subvert and eliminate the Black Panther Party and its members. The court found there to be substantial evidence that these defendants also participated in a post-raid conspiracy to cover up evidence regarding the raid, to conceal the true character of their pre-raid and raid activities." By the way, the socialist Martin Luther King Jr. was targeted by the same program, though I should mention that in the case of his assassination, concrete evidence of the FBI's involvement has not been produced. On May 4th, 1970, the Ohio National Guard fired into a crowd of students at Kent State University who were protesting the Vietnam War, killing 4 and wounding 9. You can produce a very long list of similar incidents of state violence and repression from virtually any country on Earth. On the issue of repression of freedom of speech, Mahmoud Khalil is a Palestinian student activist who has been a vocal critic of the government. He has a permanent US residency. Despite this, he was abducted from his New York apartment by federal immigration agents without a warrant and was for some reason transferred to Louisiana without notifying lawyers or his wife. Khalil spent more than 3 months as a political prisoner before his eventual conditional release. I think Metatron is possibly just ignorant to how many horrible things have happened in history in seemingly normal and democratic societies. On the point about dictatorship, I mean, yes, not every country on Earth right now is a dictatorship, but we're discussing 3 countries that no longer exist, that being fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. So in theory, it would not be out of line for me to say that every country has had some form of non-democratic governance at some point in the past. I don't know what definition of dictatorship Metatron is operating on, he doesn't say. He also doesn't really explain, quote, militarism with resources directed to domestic population. I'm taking it to maybe be a convoluted way of saying conquest of natural resources which are then directed to the aggressor country's population, which is a very common theme in history. In fact, I would argue that almost every country on Earth has done this at one point in time. However, I could be misunderstanding him. I don't really understand what he's trying to say there. I'm putting this part in here just because I think it's funny.
A typical mentality of an entitled 20-year-old who once again thinks he's better than you because he could afford an education.
Yep, definitely 20 years old. Trying to belittle someone because of their age is so weird though. Also, I'm not entitled. I am forever thankful that I was able to afford the $0 it cost me to get my education, because former communist turned social democrat Einar Gerhardsen and his government decided the state should finance education in this country. Doing one more part because it's funny, sorry. I call his channel largely low-effort React slop.
On a video that he made, which is a React video to me. The lack of self-awareness is unbelievable.
By the way, that harsh cut, that's not on me. He kind of messed up the edit a little bit. Here's what I said. Now it seems to largely be low-effort React content. And I mean lower effort than mine. I at least write a script. That's what's called a self-aware, self-deprecating joke, Metatron. The footage I'm using is from your own video.
Now, differently from him, I couldn't put a sponsor on this video because of the controversial nature of this engagement, even though I'm just defending myself while he lied about me and was financially rewarded for it. But there is one thing I can do, and that is sponsoring myself.
Something about this seems somewhat iffy to me. I had a sponsor on my video. What makes my video criticizing these guys less controversial than their video attacking me in return? Maybe it could have been the part where he portrays me as wanting to shoot every liberal. Sponsors usually set out guidelines for what you can and can't do for your video. I've discussed the Holocaust in past videos and sponsors have been completely fine with it as my content was educational, not denialist, and squarely anchored in the sources. In fact, in the previous video I also mentioned the Holocaust. If it is like Metatron says that his video was too controversial for a sponsorship, then I can't really figure out why that would be. I think it's more likely that he just didn't have a sponsorship offer on this one. I don't always have an offer ready for every video either. It's perfectly fine to admit that a sponsor didn't reach out to you. And the fact that one did isn't a mark of status. We're all just trying to make ends meet. Speaking of making ends meet, Metatron says and does something very stupid. He says that Nazi Germany looks like capitalism, but is actually socialism.
Exactly, I double down on that. And also, you know what is capitalism and not socialism? Grab all that capitalist money.
Metatron makes the argument that being a worker who gets paid for their work is, quote, not socialism. I'm a worker. Capitalists own the platform I make content on. They pay me back a cut of the profit that I generate for them. Every worker in the world lives under similar conditions. They do not own the factories, the call centers, and the shops they work in. My income and therefore my survival is predicated on my labor, not on me owning something. It's kind of rich of the guy who's selling a product, plushies of a grown man, to ridicule the working class for accepting the money of capitalists. A position the working class is forced into. The world where the working class is not forced into this position, that is socialism. Stalin posited socialism in one country. Metatron bravely develops this position into socialism in one person. This isn't even the stupidest thing he does in this section. The really bad part is here.
I should probably have a little talk with, by the way, with whom I will never work ever, considering they just financially rewarded someone with thousands of dollars for a video where he associated me with the Nazis, publicly.
Metatron is openly stating his intent to cause financial damages by contacting sponsors and telling them I did something which I demonstrably did not do. Shadiversity frequently bandied about the term defamation, and Metatron used the term slander. These are legal terms. Quoting Cornell Law School, to prove defamation, a plaintiff must show 4 things. A false statement purporting to be fact, publication or communication of that statement to a third person, fault amounting to at least negligence, and damages. I'm not indicating that I'm going to take any sort of action over a stupid YouTube video, but I'm trying to show you how dumb what he's doing here is. I have to mention one last thing about Metatron, and it's his conception of politics. On the topic of politics in video games, I brought up the thoughts of FinalFantasy Tactics script, scenario writer, and editor about the politics in his game, in which he describes a game about, quote, a young man who fought tirelessly against the entrenched social class system. Metatron responds by saying,
irrelevant. This is a false equivalence. The kind of politics that is injected today is left versus right. The kind of politics that you just read here is up versus down. Up versus down unites. Left versus right divides.
What Metatron is describing here as up-down is what's called class struggle. The struggle between the lower class to better its position and the upper class to maintain its position. Discussing the history of the left-right dichotomy from its origins in France and the ways it involved in France, the author Marcel Gauget points out a very interesting historic phenomenon which you may recognize in how Metatron talks about politics here. Quote, "Note, by the way, that we have here in this discussion of extremism the key to the asymmetry in the attitudes of right and left towards the existence of the right-left division. Clearly the division was promoted by the left, while the right, which had little use for it, tended to deny its existence or refuse to acknowledge it. This is because the left in general, even the moderate left, sees division as a driving force and hope for a future of concord, whereas the right sees it as damaging, artificial, and a distraction from the essential, which is the quest for unity and harmony. The left views conflict over interests as inevitable in a so-called unequal society, particularly class conflict, and wishes to push these conflicts to the forefront where they have to be reconciled in order to pursue an eventual concord on the other side of the conflict. The right, which stands largely for the maintenance of the status quo, has no interest in even acknowledging this sort of conflict, because it can lead to change." Shadiversity says I should have been looking at the channel Shadiversity more because that's where he's producing the most content. Going forward, it certainly seems to be the case, but I can only look backward at the evidence he has produced so far. Speaking of not being able to travel into the future, these are the history videos Shadiversity says I should have been aware of had I only, quote, fact-checked myself.
Where if you wanted to find recent content of me talking about, history, I wonder where he could have gone to find that. And doesn't know. He doesn't know where to look, guys. If you want to go on, 9 days ago, looking at the valid historical swordsmanship in this game trailer, we go into some elements of history in our reaction to the concept of giant swords, reacting to the great unsubscribe guys. Great exclusive video talking about how the katana has been perceived throughout its history and why some of the misinformations, have arisen. That's an exclusive video. How would a knight change a katana based on their historical perspective and how they viewed swords and what design elements they valued in swords? And look at that, the spear bow, 3 weeks ago.
The oldest video Shadiversity points out was released on July 5th, 2025. The astute observer may notice a significant challenge to me watching this video before I released my own. It didn't exist at that time. My video was released on June 29th, 2025, before any of the videos Shadiversity talks about were made. The date that a video was released on is publicly available information on YouTube. Shadiversity specifically pointed out those videos which were uploaded after my critique of the three creators' approach to history. Nonetheless, as I agree I did not adequately represent Shadiversity's approach to history, I will attempt to specifically use the video Shadiversity himself highlighted as representative of his approach to history. Hopefully this alleviates his concerns with me cherry-picking whenever I select for things to highlight. In my original video, I identified a tendency among these history creators to reason themselves towards what probably happened in history, based on their experience in reenactment and the knowledge they have accrued over the course of their YouTube careers. Here is what I said. They sometimes use primary source materials as a jumping off point, but from then on begin to rationalize how, quote, things worked back then based on their own personal experience. It's all argumentation and deduction based on what they believe, their preconceived notions, and their experiences. Here's what Shadiversity says at the 1 minute and 23 second mark in his video on the spear bow.
And it would be a functional weapon. My takeaway in that video is that this has potential to work. The interesting thing about speculation like that is that even in the modern day, if we come across something that actually has some logical validity to it, like there's functionality to this speculation, if it works, it is very likely that someone probably tried this in the past.
My thesis in the original video is that this is a problematic approach to history. There is only one way to say with any certainty whatsoever that someone of the past probably did a thing, and that is to have evidence pointing to the fact that they did. The fact that your experience shows that a spear bow could work as a practical weapon only indicates that it is possible that it could have occurred, not that it is probable that someone did use it as one. Now, Shad has some evidence, but prior to this, he did not. My critique is of his method. What happens when he makes a similar rationalization but no evidence supporting his claim is discovered? The problem with these sorts of assertions about the past is that you cannot in any way, shape, or form control for the innumerable factors working upon one another in the past. Here's the full and total extent to which Shadiversity works with sources in this video.
So it turns out that this is a Viking weapon, or a weapon of that period, and Lars found references of this weapon in some museum journals, it seems like, and then he actually tracked this thing down and confirmed that, no, there are bows, remnants of bows, that have spear heads attached to the top. They were absolutely real. And then he also goes to the history and where he researched it. Great video.
Around the 17-minute mark, he begins to theorize why the spear bow wasn't more readily adopted because his tests show that it was surprisingly effective. It's the same method I described in my initial video. I don't think I misrepresented how these guys approach history. In his video on Ninth Path's animations, he doesn't mention a single source. He just asserts representations of swordfighting as correct or incorrect representations of historical swordfighting. If he had not himself specifically said that this was a history video that I should have checked out, I would have had no problem with it, because it just seems like he's discussing physicality and movement, not history. He mentions they go into some history in their React video about giant swords. They do the same thing where they assert things as more or less similar to historical swords, but show no sources. He does pull out his sword though, and that's fun. Their props, authentic as they may be, aren't sources in and of themselves. If they represent a historic object, point to the object and sources discussing the object, where you learned about the object. The video about how a knight would change a katana is fine, I guess, but it has the same issue as the others. There's no connection to the research of history, the field itself. Shad's co-host asserts what makes a katana, but it doesn't point to where he learned what actually makes a katana. He's obviously not lying to you here, but he's also not really working with history. Shadiversity introduces the concept of the video, which is not to utilize or discuss historical sources, but to
discuss what might more logically change or remain the same.
To be clear, there's nothing inherently wrong with doing this. I'm just saying, don't frame it as history. This isn't at all dangerous or problematic when it's something as low stakes as what makes a katana, but I pointed to a specific issue with creators like these that I believe stems from their method. After a while, you might get very comfortable just asserting things without pointing to any evidence. You begin to reason and argue yourself towards answers that should be illuminated by sources. This is what Lindybeige did in his video about the T-34, where he reasoned himself towards answers based on what he was experiencing in the moment, seeing with his own eyes. What Metatron did when he didn't utilize sources to contextualize Nazi politics, and what Shadiversity does on his channels. History, as E.H. Carr said, quote, is a continuous process of interaction between the historian and his facts, an unending dialogue between the present and the past. A fact does not become a fact of history by pure assertion alone. In history, it needs some connection to the past, a source, which is contextualized and analyzed by a historian, and turned into a fact of history. There's one last video that Shadiversity pointed to, which seems to be the one that relates most to history. Unfortunately, it's paywalled. I don't necessarily think it's reasonable to expect me to pay to access evidence for his rebuttal.
For Lindybeige, he doesn't really care about this individual giving him any attention, and justifiably so. So I'll speak a little bit about Lindybeige after I address the attacks against me.
That is incorrect. Lindybeige cared enough to write a little essay in my comments, which we'll look at in a moment. Lindybeige made his response on July 7, 2025, sometime around 4:05 PM UK time. That's 23 days before Shadiversity released this video. YouTube truncates the listed date to 1 month when it's over 1 month ago, but less than 2 months ago. But I made a tweet about the comment the same day, and that is accurately timestamped. Being that Shadiversity had 23 days to learn about this response, it's reasonable to assume that he was either completely ignorant of its existence or is being misleading. This may seem like a nitpick, but it's important, because Shadiversity goes on to say,
and what Fredda does to try and vilify Lloyd is truly despicable. As despicable as what he did to me and Metatron, and digging up old things that he can't even confirm if Lloyd even holds those opinions, and then hyper-focusing and the things without proper context, when Lloyd is the type of person who is willing to talk about nearly anything. Is that type of intellectual person.
What he's referring to here is me showing, citing, and quoting Lindybeige's essays from his own website, which Shadiversity leaves out of his video. In my video, I said that I cannot confirm that Lindybeige still holds these beliefs and that the essays are not time-stamped, but that he has issued no retractions or corrections. I think it's better to evaluate someone's character based on evidence instead of lack of evidence. As such, I leave open the possibility for Lindybeige to say, I no longer believe those things, I was wrong. One of my key focuses was Lindybeige's insistence on the right to refer to the Sami, Norway's indigenous minority, by an ethnic slur. Coincidentally, this is the same indigenous minority that Art Warhammer and his moderators were talking about murdering. Shadiversity seems to imply that Lindybeige may no longer hold those beliefs, so I'm possibly sloppily misrepresenting Lindybeige's character. Things he says and believes are kind of indistinguishable from what that one slightly racist old guy...
So right near the beginning, he tries to imply that Lloyd is definitely slightly racist, guys. So we're already dealing with incredible bad faith approach.
In the comment Lindybeige made, he offered no retractions and doubled down on his right to use the ethnic slur because it's just his language. Bear in mind, of course, that it isn't his language, it's not an English word, it's a word used by English speakers, but the word was picked up by English speakers from Scandinavians. It very much is a Scandinavian word, and how it was invented very much does matter. I don't think it's unfair to call him at least a little bit racist because of his belittling response to the Sami, just wanting you to call them by their name instead of a slur. But it could just be that he's so stubborn that any correction on what would usually be a minor mistake has him linking arms with racists. Because the whole reason he wrote this essay was that a Swedish person politely pointed out that he was using a slur instead of the actual term for this people. Literally all he had to do was say, sorry, my bad, and nobody would bat an eye. He also does mention that I was just using one legal definition of genocide for a quote, point-scoring criticism. Of course, the definition I used was the UN definition, referring it to as one of many definitions is delusional. The only reason I brought up genocide was that when I showed all of Lindebeij's essays, I had to address the content of this one, because Lindebeij decided to title it, quote, what Holocaust, ? So I had to preemptively defend him against aspersions that he may be a Holocaust denier. In so doing, I had to read the essay, and when doing so, I decided to make it a teachable moment, as Lindebeij makes a common mistake when it comes to what constitutes a genocide, when he refers to the Holocaust as, quote, attempted genocide. There's no such thing as an attempted genocide, as there is no percentage quantity of a people that must be destroyed before something is a completed genocide, so to say. You can watch the old video where I explain more. In this video on the spear bow, Shadiversity cited a YouTube creator called Lars Andersen 23. That creator also made a short 1 minute and 23 second video on the origins of the Viking Age, where Lars illustrates that he understands how history is written.
The Danes were already raiding, way before 793. So why suddenly does the Viking Age begin in 793? In this small Danish book from 1873, Vosso invents the idea of the Viking Age, a heroic story to lift a broken nation. Few have read the book, but everyone believes the story. His earliest source said Danes attacked England in 780, but today we know the Danes attacked even earlier, centuries even. Later historians pointed to a raid in 793, but overlooked the fact that warriors had been sailing out of the north for centuries. So the Viking Age, it didn't begin with a raid, it began with a book.
Lars says the Viking Age began in 1873 because the term was coined in a book written for nationalistic reasons. History is not apolitical. I don't know if this is sufficient evidence to assert that this specifically is where the term the Viking Age originated. I'm not an expert on that topic, and it very well may be the case that Lars is getting a little ahead of himself here. But regardless of these possibilities, he demonstrates an understanding for what history actually is. The most formative book I read in my undergraduate studies was Landscape of History by John Lewis Gaddis, which I've mentioned before. The book wasn't on the curriculum. I bought the book myself because I wanted to better understand what history was as a field, and how it was written. The book cites other authors which I've cited, like E.H. Carr and his work What is History? This book is what led me to understand the issues of objectivity in history. It led me to understand that history is a narrative representation of the past, that history is not a series of crystallized, unchanging facts, but something that is ever-changing and constantly being revised as we understand more about the past. It led me to understand that history is not apolitical, as people like Metatron portray it. When I talked about these fundamental aspects of history writing, Metatron rejected my sources and accused me of attacking truth and objectivity. He called me a biased propagandist who spreads left-wing or communistic propaganda. I am a propagandist. I make so-called debunking videos to draw in a wider audience because these videos get more views. I manipulate these people into watching my videos thinking they're just drama slop. I then trick them into listening to how history is actually written and how it is actually understood by academics. I also point out how creators out there are weaponizing lies about history and how it is written in order to push a right-wing agenda that can be harmful to you, the viewer. I do this because history isn't apolitical. I do this because if they're going to weaponize history, I should provide you with a means to defend yourself against it. I do this because I believe that the people who dedicate their lives to the writing of history don't just do so because it's cool or interesting. They do so because they believe that arming people with knowledge will lead to a better world. Metatron portrayed me as a highly biased Stalinist. On the basis of this, I should point out that John Lewis Gaddis, who opened my eyes to all of this, the fundamental nature of history as a field, is an American right-winger who supported the Iraq War. Thank you everyone for watching. Thank you to War Thunder for sponsoring this video. Check out War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, Xbox, or mobile now by using the link in the description or the pinned comment below, and claim your limited time massive bonus pack, available to new and returning players on PC and console. I want to thank all of you once again for watching, and the patrons who have supported me for so long. I think that hopefully soon I'm going to be financially stable enough to start upgrading my PC and my audio setup to finally iron out all those weird audio artifacts I hear in my voiceover. Also, when this video finishes premiering, I will likely be live on Twitch, where I just got partnered. Go check that out, it's linked below. I'm trying to get it quiet down please, I'm trying to read. Is there a fire exit? Ah! No! They took my fucking pipe! No! please. I also want to give a special thanks to the patrons at the $10 tier. Liquid Day Zero, Jernfronten, Willow B, Shemon, Dude Main, The History Enjoyer, Swyron C, Garion, Gil the Gilded Dragon, Youngjin S, Jesse F, Keenan F, Hen Gamer, Gwiggan, Bashire, Jordan M, and Monday's Last Brain Cell.